We're beginning today with Book 9 of the Nicomachean Ethics, and this book continues the discussion of Book 8 on friendship, which so far has seemed to be an interesting, although perhaps secondary or even a kind of appendix-like account in relationship to the main thrust of Aristotle's ethical theory. However, one thing I think we see in Book 9 is that friendship actually serves an important role in Aristotle's ethics, at least on a certain interpretation of it. The theory of friendship serves to fill a gap between the philosophically derived account of the human good of eudaimonia as virtuous activity that fulfills the human function, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the needed concession to common sense that we saw Aristotle essentially tack on to his overall conception of eudaimonia at the end of Book 1, when he said that in addition to virtuous activity, which fulfills the human function, we also need an adequate amount of external goods. Recall that these external goods are called external because they are external to the life of virtue itself, as opposed to the internal goods of the virtuous life, the kind of satisfaction that one gets in doing fine actions, for example. That would be a good internal to the virtuous life. But there are also external goods, things that can be obtained by people who are vicious, or at least not virtuous. Things, for example, like money, bodily pleasures, honors, health, and the like. And so Aristotle has said, well, common sense tells us that a person who's perfectly virtuous, who's functioning in that sense properly as a human being, isn't necessarily happy if they lack an adequate supply of such external goods. So we need to kind of tack that on to our account of eudaimonia and say, eudaimonia is the fulfillment of the human function, which is virtuous activity, the activity of the virtues of character and thought, and then also an adequate amount of external goods. And one thing I want to suggest in this video a little bit later on is that there's something deeply philosophically unsatisfying about that account. On the one hand, we have this philosophically derived conclusion that says eudaimonia must be this because of the essence of human nature, essentially. And then also we need to add on these other things because common sense tells us that they need to be added on. That doesn't seem to really be doing justice to what a philosophical account is supposed to be. Provide us with a kind of unified philosophically derived theory. And so what does friendship have to do with this? Well, what I want to suggest is that later on in this book, Aristotle will suggest a way in which friendship actually bridges that gap. Friendship is the glue, so to speak, that brings together the life of virtuous activity and the external goods into a kind of unified picture. And so what I want to suggest then is that contrary to the way you might read it, as if friendship is just sort of stuck in here at the Nicomachean Ethics as almost as a kind of appendix after the main work has been done, as we've already accounted, of course, for what the virtues are and so on, which seemed to be the main work that needed to be done after the function argument. And then we talk about friendship because, I don't know, Aristotle has a side interest in friendship or something like that. But I think that's not actually what's going on here. I think friendship actually in Aristotle's mind serves a critical role in the overall theory because it does provide this way to bridge the gap between the virtuous life, which has already been philosophically derived, and the life of external goods. It provides a kind of derivation of how the virtuous life is related to the life that includes an adequate amount of external goods. So anyway, that's what I want to suggest a little later. But first, in these first three chapters, we see a kind of continuation of Book 8, I think, is the best way to look at these. Beginning with the first chapter, we have a discussion of friendships with dissimilar aims. Essentially, this chapter concerns the equalization of the benefits that each friend provides to the other. Remember, friendship essentially is characterized by friends benefiting each other in real concrete ways, material ways often. And so in order for the friendship to be maintained, we've already seen that there needs to be some kind of equality maintained in these benefits, or at least some kind of proportionality, some kind of proportionate equality. A key point here is that it's the benefits rather than the other, him or herself, that the one friend wants from the other in all but the virtuous friendship. So, in the virtuous friendship, what you want from the other is essentially the other himself or herself. The other, you could say that the other himself or herself is the benefit that the friend gets from the virtuous friend. But in friendships of pleasure and utility, it's not so much the person as the benefit you're getting from the person. You know, the laughs that you get from that funny person who may not be someone you respect as a virtuous person, but you like to hang out with them because they're funny. And what you get from them is not them so much as laughs. And of course, it's even more obvious in cases of friendships based on utility. What you get from the person who's handy at carpentry work is the carpentry work that they're able to do on your house, on the basis of a kind of barter system. You scratch my back, I scratch yours, or something like that. I suggested the example of someone who maybe you're a green thumb, you're a good gardener, and so you can rely on your friend to do handiwork around the house, and to kind of keep the relationship on a good level. You occasionally bring some produce that you've grown in your garden over to that carpenter friend, and so on, and in that way things kind of equal out. But it's really the benefits. It's not so much the person themselves. The person's character itself matters only minimally in the friendship. And this can be the cause of disputes when you have these sort of dissimilar aims where you want one thing and the other friend wants something else. Now, in cases where a monetary value can be fixed on the benefits, there's usually no problem. In other cases, it's quite often that expectations are not met, and especially in cases where it's kind of awkward or uncomfortable or difficult or unconventional to fix a monetary value on the benefits. And a prime example of this is in erotic friendships, where there can often be misunderstandings, missed expectations, because people don't want to come out and say, look, I don't know, I'll take you out to dinner twice a month if you'll have sexual relations with me 6 times a month or something like that. That sounds like a kind of prostitution relationship that many people would find to be shameful or embarrassing or degrading to be talking about explicitly. Even if, in fact, that is kind of the relationship you've negotiated with a person, as is often the case. And so, but since people don't want to talk about these things, they don't want to just translate it into a relationship where a monetary value can be fixed. Often expectations are not met. There's another problem with this too, which is the problem of incommensurability. Incommensurability, that is lack of a common measure. Often, it's difficult to measure how, without money, without currency, what the value is of the benefits that each friend is respectively providing the other. And often misunderstandings arise in which one friend thinks the benefit that the friend is providing is greater than it is. So sometimes you may think for, a kind of, what would be an example of this? A sort of a rich or famous person who is sort of full of themselves, let's say, and thinks that, I should go into this restaurant, this fine dining establishment, and I should just be comped my food. Because after all, I'm a rich, famous person, and I'm creating buzz that this is a hot restaurant to go to because this famous person went there. And so they go there expecting that they should not have to pay for their food, right? Or a woman who's very good looking and sits at a bar and just expects that if she talks to a man next to her, that the man should pay for her drink, something like that. That would be an example of where one person is thinking that the benefit they're providing to the other person has a certain value, which the other person may not agree with. And that can cause disputes or disagreements between friends. So how can such disputes be avoided? Aristotle suggests that an agreement should be made in advance whenever possible. It should be voluntary, obviously, because we're talking about friendship. So it should be a coerced or involuntary agreement. Then you're not dealing with a friendship anymore. And he suggests that the beneficiary should set the value and pay the benefactor after the benefit has been provided. The one case in which the incommensurability of the benefits is no problem, Aristotle thinks, is in the case of friendships based upon virtue. He says on page 163, this is towards the bottom in section 7, but where no agreement about services is made, friends who give services because of the friend himself are not open to accusation, as we have said, since this is what the friendship that accords with virtue is like. See, there's a word missing there in our text, but I added in the is. And the return should accord with the decision of the original giver, since decision is proper to a friend and to virtue. And it would seem that the same sort of return should also be made to those who have shared philosophy in common with us, for its worth is not measured by money, and no equivalent honor can be paid, but it is enough, presumably, to do what we can, as we also do towards gods and parents. You know, friendship, there used to be these credit card commercials a few years ago where we're talking about things, the prices of things, and then there would be something that was priceless. It seems like Aristotle is saying philosophy is priceless. There's no price that you can put on it. So friendships based on virtue aren't the kind of thing that you really can put a price on. But nonetheless, there's not a problem because you're not expecting really anything back. It's the very activity of engaging in a virtuous activity with a friend like this, in the paradigm case being philosophizing with your friend. There's not a price that you can put on that, but you don't need to worry about it because you're getting the benefit immediately, so to speak. By the very engagement with your friend in conversation, you're getting the benefit right away. There's not going to be any problem afterwards where you say, hey, wait a minute, did I really get enough out of this? It doesn't really make sense in those cases. That's what Aristotle seems to want to say. Why are friendships in accord with virtue like this? Well, the best answer seems to be that the benefactor receives an immediate benefit back, since it's pleasant in itself to benefit a person that one admires. So the mere fact that, I'm immediately aware of the fact that I'm benefiting you, or I seem to be at least, by having this conversation with you. You seem to be enjoying yourself, and that's enough to make it worthwhile. Second chapter deals with conflicts between types of friendships. So Aristotle considers the possibility that conflicts may arise between the different types of friendships that one's a part of. What should we do when our obligations to our friends conflict and we can only fulfill a subset of these obligations? Aristotle says, as he says often when dealing with these kind of cases of conflict, is that there's no formula. Phronesis, prudence is required in all these cases. That's his kind of his standard answer. But then he'll go on to kind of give a rule of thumb, as he often does. And he says, in general, returning a favor or a benefit takes precedence over providing a favor. So if you have two friends, one of whom has benefited you before in the past, and they could use a favor now, you should benefit that friend before you benefit someone who you don't owe a favor. And that seems sort of commonsensical. So one should repay a loan to a friend before giving a gift to another friend. This is in section 3 on page 164, where he makes this point. However, you shouldn't take this as an absolute principle. In some cases, he says it may be finer and more necessary. We know what that means for Aristotle. It's finer and more necessary to actually give a gift to a friend than to repay a loan. And we can imagine such cases. Aristotle doesn't really give a concrete example, but For example, let's say that, you have a friend and this friend gets a 1 in a million job interview that he didn't expect to get. He applied for this job, but he thought the odds were so long he didn't expect to get it. And he needs you, to loan him money so that he can buy a new suit or transportation or something like that. And all you have to give, all you have to spare is money that you're about to use to pay off a loan that another friend had made to you. However, this friend that you owe money has no urgent need for the money. He has no urgent need for the money to be paid back. And so in that kind of case, this is the sort of case in which Aristotle might say, well, even though as a general rule, before doing a favor for a friend, should pay off a loan to another friend. In this case, we could see a justification for holding off on paying back the loan and giving the money that should have gone to pay back the loan to this other friend who needs it for the job interview. And there are other cases like this. Let's say someone who has lent to you is really a bad person. So you're dealing with a kind of friendship of utility here. So someone has lent to you in the past and you pay them back, let's say, and then like a year later now they want a loan from you. And it should seem like, well, I should reciprocate because that person loaned me money. But Aristotle says, well, it's not necessarily the case. I mean, they lent to you knowing that you're a good person and you would pay them back. But you know that they're a bad person and they may very well not pay you back. So he would say you would have no need to reciprocate in that kind of circumstance. So in these kind of situations, it's always possible for there to be exceptions to what the general rules are by which we resolve the conflict. But you have to use your prudence. You have to use your phronesis, your practical wisdom. Even our parents who gave us being do not necessarily have a right to expect everything they might want from us. Aristotle says that in general, you have an obligation to support your parents if they're in need, to honor them, to do what's proper with respect to them, like, opening the door for your mother or whatever, that kind of thing. But there are limits, he seems to suggest. And again, these are a matter for prudential reasoning. Presumably, it's not necessary for you to, let's say, sacrifice your life for the sake of the convenience of your mother or something like that. I mean, there are limits to this sort of thing. The third chapter, which is the last, I would say, of the chapters that are sort of doing cleanup work from Book 3, dealing with these sort of miscellaneous issues that arose already, I would say, in, not Book 3, but in Book 8, rather, that arose already in Book 8. So in Chapter 3, we get the last of these chapters that are dealing with this sort of carryover from Book 8. And here we're dealing with the question of the disillusion of friendships. And we saw in Book 8 that Aristotle had discussed in ways in which friendships based upon pleasure or utility have a natural tendency to dissolve. Since what pleases a person or what needs they have a tendency to change over time. And he suggests that such friendships can dissolve amicably since people understand this, they experience it themselves. So it's not like every person you've stopped calling to go out and, have a drink with or whatever is going to resent you for that, because they might understand that now, you're more into spending your recreational time doing this other thing rather than going out and partying with them like you used to when you were younger and foolish. However, in some cases, people will feel deceived, as he says in the second paragraph of chapter 3. We might, however, accuse a friend if he really liked us for utility or pleasure and pretended to like us for our character. For as we said at the beginning, friends are most at odds when they are not friends in the way they think they are. Here we have the kind of standard junior high example, right, of the person who you thought was your friend, but was just using you, as we say, when we're 14 years old. I thought you were my friend, but you were just using me. What does Aristotle say about this kind of situation? Well, for one thing, the responsibility for the misunderstanding can rest with either party. So he says, it's continuing in the next paragraph, and so if we mistakenly suppose that we are loved for our character when our friend is doing nothing to suggest this, we must hold ourselves responsible. This might happen, for example, in erotic friendships where you might think that this person really, likes you for yourself, wants to be in a serious relationship with you, but they've really done nothing to suggest this. In fact, all their behavior just suggests that they're just using you as someone to take them out to the movies or take them out to dinner or just to accompany them to parties so they don't have to go by themselves. And they may have suggested nothing that they have no use for you beyond that. And so in that case, Aristotle is going to say that you shouldn't blame them. You should blame yourself because they've given you no indication that they're interested in you for your character. But, of course, we could also be deceived by his pretense. And they may very well have given misleading indications that they were interested for your character. So the responsibility for this can rest with either party. The saddest case is that when we accept a friend because he's a good person and then he goes bad or breaks bad. When I read this, I was naturally reminded of the garage scene in Hank Schrader's garage in Breaking Bad. For any of you who have seen that, I might try to link it in the description if I remember. Where Hank finally reveals to Walter White, aka meth kingpin Heisenberg, that he thinks that I don't know who you are. I thought I knew who you are, but I don't know who you are. That's the great tragedy that when the person you thought was a friend and you became a friend with them because you thought they were a good person turned out to be bad. But every case isn't like the Breaking Bad scenario between Hank and Walt. That's a situation where the friendship has to be dissolved because the one person has become incurably bad. There's no coming back from where Walter White / Heisenberg has gone, morally speaking. But, of course, in some cases, you might see a friend drift astray and they can be brought back. And so this is another area where prudence needs to be exercised. You need to decide, is this friendship salvageable? That you were friends with the person because they were good. Now they've gone in the direction of being bad, but maybe they can be brought back. And so it's not cut and dried one way or another. Another case that's in a way more interesting is that it may be that there are two decent people who become friends with each other, two decent but imperfect people, let's say. And then one comes to far excel the other in virtue. And Aristotle seems to be thinking here primarily of cases, let's say, in which one friend matures and the other doesn't. For example, one friend may decide to better himself or herself, get an education. He may come to take life more seriously, while the other continues to see life as one big party. Life is a cabaret. That's the motto of one friend, but the other friend sees it as serious business. Often this kind of thing will come up when, let's say, if one friend undergoes a religious conversion, which can also take the form of a kind of political conversion in some cases. Like one friend becomes vegan. And so, there's no more going out for tacos with your friend after a party or something like that you always would do with that friend. And that can cause a strain with the friendship. Aristotle thinks that this kind of scenario is going to dissolve the friendship as a rule. However, he says we should still keep some memory of it and the familiarity that we used to have with this person. You shouldn't just treat them as, someone that you've hardly even met or you hadn't even met. Like the old, you act like we never have met, like the old Bob Dylan song. Okay. Now, chapter 4. With chapter 4, I would say we get into the new, deeper material that really advances the discussion of friendship beyond what had occurred in Book 8, and really is the core, I would say, of Aristotle's overall account of friendship, beginning with chapter 4. Whereas chapters 1 through 3 represent small supplements to the discussion of Book 8. With Chapter 4, Aristotle begins to develop a major enhancement of his theory of friendship. And this is the notion that the friend is another myself. The friend is another myself. Chapter 4 begins this way. The defining features of friendship that are found in friendship to one's neighbors would seem to be derived from features of friendship towards oneself. For a friend is taken to be someone who wishes and does goods or apparent goods to his friend for the friend's own sake, or one who wishes the friend to be and to live for the friend's own sake. This is how mothers feel towards their children and how friends who have been in conflict feel. Others take a friend to be one who spends his time with his friend and makes the same choices, or one who shares his friend's distress and enjoyment. And this also is especially true of mothers. And people define friendship by one of these features. So, he doesn't come right out and say here that a friend is another myself, but he's preparing the ground for eventually saying this by noticing that the relationship to the friend seems to be similar to the relationship that people have to themselves. And even it may even be the case that the relationship that one has to oneself is sort of the model or the template for understanding what friendship is. Friendship is like, the relationship to the friend is like the relationship that one has to oneself. So the defining features of friendship are defined from something like the relationship to oneself. And these include wishing goods for the friend's own sake. Wishing goods for the friend's own sake. I wish goods for myself. I don't wish it for the sake of something else, or for the sake of somebody else, but just for my own sake. No one thinks, of course, you need some special reason to wish goods for yourself. You wish them for their own sake. They're not good only for the sake of something else. They're good for its own sake. So what Aristotle is saying is that this feature of true friendship, where you're wishing goods to the friend for the friend's own sake, actually seems to be derived from the way in which we wish goods for ourselves. First, you might say, we wish goods for ourselves, for our own sake, and then that becomes kind of the model for ideally how you relate to a friend. Spending time with a friend. The friend is the person you want to spend time with. And you spend time with yourself, usually whether you like to or not. More on that in a minute. You share decisions with a friend. Whether you like it or not, the decisions that you make are shared with yourself. You have to suffer the consequences of the decisions you make for yourself. And shares pleasures and pains as well. You share pleasures and pains with a friend. You share pleasures and pains with yourself. So notice here Aristotle twice mentions that the mother's relationship to the child seems like the paradigm of the friend. The typical mother is prone to regard her child certainly as another myself. So we're already kind of anticipating this idea. But the point he's making here, again, is just that it seems like these remarks that we've been making since the beginning of Book 8 about the relationship that friends have to friends actually, first of all, seems to hold true in the relation that we have to ourselves. Whether it is wishing goods for its own sake, spending time, sharing decisions, or sharing pleasures and pains. Now, Aristotle says, though, that it's really the decent person who relates to herself in this way most of all. It's notable that this is the quality of the decent person, not the vicious person. In other words, it's the decent person, the good person, the virtuous person, we might say, who is most of all a friend to herself. And therefore, by implication, the people in the other categories, which includes not just vicious people, but also now we've seen someone like the incontinent person. these people are going to, only in a more problematic sense, are going to be able to be friends to themselves. That's what he wants to say. And I note here, just because I'm also in my other class talking about the Republic, that we see a bit of an echo of Plato's teaching in the Republic here as well, about the internal psychology of the virtuous person contrasted with the internal psychology of the vicious person. The account of friendship, which initially may have seemed peripheral to ethics, here turns out to be pertinent to the crucial question, why be moral, I would say. Aristotle, so far, hadn't really considered the question that is so central to Plato's ethical theory, at least as it appears in the Republic, which is this question of why should I be moral, as it's come to be translated throughout the history of Western philosophy. In Plato, it's more the question of what is justice, such that it itself is an intrinsic good for the soul of the person who has it. But it answers this question of sort of why I should desire to be a just person as opposed to an unjust person. Why should I be moral? And that hadn't been a central question so far in the way Aristotle pursues the subject matter of ethics. But here you could see him, at least obliquely or indirectly, addressing this question in the account of friendship. And the one-line answer would be something like, so you can live with yourself. That's why you should be moral. You should be moral so you can live with yourself. Or more expansively, so you can be a friend to yourself, so that you won't hate yourself, despise yourself, and regard yourself as an enemy. That's why you should be moral. So you can be a friend to yourself. Even today, of course, we still might reproach someone by saying, how can you live with yourself given these things that you're doing? And Aristotle, as we know and as we'll see again, regards living together as characteristic of friendship. And so the question how you can live with yourself is directly pertinent to the question of why one should be a moral person. Section 3, he says, this is page 167, continuing to 168. For the excellent person, and when he says the excellent person, this is the same thing as the virtuous person. Same word in Greek, or cognate words. For the excellent person is of one mind with himself and desires the same things in his whole soul. Hence he wishes good and apparent goods to himself and achieves them in his actions, since it is proper to the good person to reach the good by his efforts. He wishes and does them for his own sake, since he does them for the sake of his thinking part, and that is what each person seems to be. Moreover, he wishes himself to live and to be preserved, and he wishes this for his rational part most of all. So the excellent person is of one mind. He's not divided in his soul between what he believes is good and what he wants to do, which is, of course, characteristic of the incontinent person. The incontinent person believes one thing as what he should do, and does another thing. He wants to do something different. That's true even of the continent person who has to struggle to do good. But the virtuous person is of one mind, has a unified mind. Unlike the vicious person, the good that the virtuous person wishes for himself are real goods. Hence, he's able to give himself real goods to himself in his actions. And that's what Aristotle seems to be getting at here when he says that it's proper to the good person to actually be able to achieve good by his efforts, to reach the good by his efforts. The vicious person chooses things that appear good to the vicious person, that appear good to him, but he's actually harming himself by pursuing those things. So he doesn't reach the good by his efforts. It's proper to the good person to reach the good. Unlike the incontinent person, the decent person does not fail at reaching the good by his efforts because of weakness or lack of control. And unlike the vicious person, the decent person does not fail reaching the good because he is aiming at the wrong thing. So he wishes goods for himself and he gives them to himself for his own sake. So it's really only the decent person who's the true friend to himself. The incontinent person and the vicious person are actually their own worst enemy, as we might say. Look at that vicious person over there. dealing drugs, shooting up heroin every day. He's his own worst enemy. He thinks that that's a good thing. He thinks this is the way to have a pleasant life. But that's because what appears good to him is not really good because he's a vicious person. And so he ends up not as a friend to himself, but as his own worst enemy. That's a way of thinking about what Aristotle is saying here. It's only the virtuous person who's really the friend to himself. Also, we see here that Aristotle shows how the wholly good person wholly identifies with this thinking or rational part. He's not vacillating between identifying with the understanding and identifying with the lower part of the soul, the appetites, but he wholly identifies with the rational part. However, Aristotle also suggests that every person, every human being, ultimately identifies with his or her understanding. This is who we think we are, and no one wants to be something else. Of course, we might say, I wish I were someone else. But what we really mean is, I wish I had the goods that other person has over there, while at the same time remaining myself. I don't really wish to be that other person, which would be a kind of wish for self-annihilation. I guess some people might wish for that, but Aristotle doesn't think so. Aristotle thinks that what we're really wishing for is to be ourselves, which means essentially to have our own understanding, to possess that, and then to obtain goods through our own efforts, if possible. So only a good person finds it pleasant to spend time with himself, and only a good person wishes to do so. And this is because the memories of what he's done are pleasant to think about. I could think back on the things I've done, the life I've lived, and I can achieve a kind of satisfaction. I did that. I achieved that. I feel good about that I did that. So looking backwards, the person can achieve a kind of pleasure in memory, in remembrance. And looking forwards, because he's laid a foundation for future happiness, and because his expectations for the future are good, it's also pleasant for the virtuous person to imagine the likely future. Further, keeping in mind that such a person has the virtues of thought as well as virtues of character, this person is going to have ample topics that he's able to study, which is, Aristotle thinks, the most enjoyable way to spend time with oneself, studying things that interest you. And you're going to have the ability to do that because of the virtues of thought that you've acquired through your efforts and your continent living, if not virtuous living. You're now able to, you can actually pick up, let's say, the Greek text of Aristotle and understand it. And so you're able to study this. Whereas the person who was just, slacking off in school and like that song, I was going to go to class, then I got high, right? That person is, miserable because they can't appreciate Aristotle. So Aristotle questions whether every person is a friend to himself. And we've already seen reasons here to begin to think that the continent, incontinent, and especially the vicious person aren't actually friends to themselves. Certainly good and decent people are friends to themselves, but matters stand differently with base and vicious people. Already with a person who's base, but perhaps not totally vicious, he seems to be thinking here of an incontinent person. It may be that they have a kind of friendship to themselves, but it's based on false ideas of what's truly good and pleasant. And this would be something like a self-indulgent person. Even the name self-indulgent suggests a kind of corrupted form of friendship to yourself. I'm a friend to myself because whenever I get the urge to have a drink, I crack open a beer or whatever, and I indulge myself. I'm a self-indulgent friend to myself in that sense. But for Aristotle, you're not really being a friend to yourself, right? If every time you desire something sweet, you eat something sweet. If every time you desire a little buzz, you consume an adult beverage, you're not really being a friend to yourself. You're being kind of a pseudo-friend to yourself. In the same way that a parent, a mother, to go back to that example, a mother who always gave in to whatever their child demanded would not really be a good mother to that child. That seems to be kind of the analogy Aristotle's thinking of. Now, the situation with the virtuous person is very bad. It's the opposite of that of the virtuous person. And with the case of the vicious person, the very bad situation the vicious person is subject to is reminiscent of Plato's account of the tyrant in the Republic, the tyrant's state of mind. So we can just go back to what Aristotle had said about the way in which it's pleasant to be a virtuous person because of the memories and expectations are good, and you can engage in study and be with yourself in a pleasant way. It's exactly the opposite in the case of the vicious person. So in the case of the vicious person, the memories of what he or she has done are unpleasant to think about. And so she seeks to flee from those memories. I don't want to dwell on the past because the past just fills me with shame and regret and self-loathing when I think about the things that I've done. And even if you don't make the moral judgment about the things you've done, typically, you might look back on your life and just think that there's a lot of suffering or unpleasantness there. And because this person hasn't laid a foundation for future happiness and his expectations for the future are not good, it's also unpleasant for him to imagine the likely future, right? So here I am, this is like the subject matter of a whole genre of country music. Like Merle Haggard, the song Mama Tried. I'm sitting here doing life in prison, doing life without parole. All I've got to look forward to, I'm 21. I think the song lyrics say that he turned 21 in prison, doing life without parole. I've got nothing to look forward to. And all I can think about is, when I think back, I think Mama tried. Mama tried to make me a better person. I didn't listen to her advice. So to look back is painful. And to look forward, I've got nothing to look forward to except life in prison. I'm 21 years old. That's the situation of the vicious person. Who would want to live that way? So the vicious person seeks to flee from himself and distract himself from thinking about what they are. This, of course, becomes a vicious cycle in a different sense, where the person, in trying to flee from their memories and their expectations, which are painful, one natural thing to do might be to drink more heavily or consume drugs more heavily. And then that just, of course, makes your situation worse. So the vicious person is unable to love themselves. They don't share their own enjoyments and distresses. Even a person who, is getting a buzz from drinking, copious amounts of alcohol or a high from heroin, they're not really enjoying it at some point because they're doing it just to escape. They're not even sharing their own enjoyments. And so, unsurprisingly, Aristotle suggests that the state of mind of the vicious person actually leads to suicidal thoughts. Quoting from the top of page 169 in section 8, he says, "Those who have done many terrible actions hate and flee from life because of their vice and destroy themselves." Those who have done many terrible actions hate and flee from life because of their vice and destroy themselves. So this notion of being able to be a friend to oneself, which follows on Aristotle's earlier analysis of the nature of friendship, it turns out to provide a powerful incentive for pursuing a life of virtue and avoiding vice. A powerful answer to the question, why be moral? One of the central questions of ethical theory that Aristotle really hasn't dealt with up to now. So we see the importance of Aristotle's account of friendship for his overall ethical theory. And I would say we haven't even gotten to the point I mentioned at the beginning of the video. But if you look at the last couple lines of chapter 4, we see a summary here of the state of vice and the advice that seems to follow from this. He says, if this state is utterly miserable, the state of having a vicious character, if this state is utterly miserable, everyone should earnestly flee from vice and try to be decent. For that is how one will have a friendly relation to oneself and will become a friend to another. So this is a very pithy, I think, statement of why should I be moral? Why should I pursue the virtuous life? Well, because the alternative is to be vicious, and everyone should earnestly flee from that so that you can have a friendly relation to yourself, as just described. and also so that you become a friend to another. And the importance of that will continue to go on to elaborate, although we've already talked about it a bit. But the importance of also being able to be a friend to another is an important part of this. Rationale or motivation for being moral. Okay, so this leads to the first discussion question. First discussion question. Do you agree with Aristotle's view that only a good and decent person can truly be friends with themselves? Why or why not? If a vicious person cannot be friends with themselves, and an incontinent person can at best only have a kind of pseudo-friendship with himself, does this provide a strong reason to pursue a life of virtue? Why or why not? So once again, first discussion question, do you agree with Aristotle's view that only a good and decent person can truly be friends with himself? Why or why not? If a vicious person cannot be friends with himself and an incontinent person can at best have only a kind of pseudo-friendship with himself, does this provide a strong reason to pursue a life of virtue? Why or why not? Following chapter 4, Aristotle continues to tighten the connection between the conditions of friendship and virtue. Whereas back in book 8, there were clear categories of friendship that seemed to be separate from virtue, the friendship of virtue. At this point, he seems to want to suggest that even the basic conditions of friendship depend upon it. And in book 8 as well, he did suggest that the virtuous friendship is really the only complete friendship, and therefore the merely pleasant friendship and the merely utilitarian friendship were kind of derivative forms, not true friendship, we might say. He said they're not complete friendship, but now it becomes even clearer that I don't think he would say that they're really friendship in the full sense at all. One of the conditions of friendship that we saw last time was goodwill. Goodwill. Here, Aristotle is crystal clear that goodwill is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of friendship. It's not friendship per se, but rather a kind of preparation for friendship. He calls it a beginning of friendship. Think about the first sprout of a plant. It's just beginning to break through the soil. It's not yet the beanstalk in the full sense. Nor is it the same thing as loving, because loving involves intensity, desire, and some sort of familiarity with the object, which goodwill does not. So, for example, one can have goodwill towards a contestant on the game show Jeopardy. You might even say, oh, I love that person. You're watching Jeopardy, and this is the person they've been on all week, and you like their personality and their style or whatever, and you're rooting for them. Aristotle would say, well, you have goodwill towards that person, but you're not friends with them, obviously. And it would be absurd to say you actually have love towards her, towards this contestant. We might say that in a kind of figurative way, but you don't literally mean that you love that person. You have goodwill. So goodwill, that's what goodwill is. It's the beginning of friendship. It's kind of preparation for friendship. It's this kind of pro attitude towards someone. But it's not friendship because it doesn't involve the actual cooperation in the provision of mutual benefits that friendship involves. I'm not doing anything to benefit this person by rooting for them as they're on Jeopardy, right? Whatever happened, of course, happened weeks ago anyway. So I couldn't do anything if I wanted to help them. Whereas in book 8, Aristotle had implied that friendship for the sake of utility or pleasure involved a kind of goodwill, here he seems to suggest otherwise. He suggests that goodwill does not lead to those types of friendships, nor do those types of friendships produce goodwill. So he says, this is on page 170, last paragraph of chapter 5. It, meaning goodwill, it does not become friendship for utility or pleasure, for these aims do not produce goodwill either. For a recipient of a benefit returns goodwill for what he has received, thereby doing the just thing, but those who wish for another's welfare because they hope to enrich themselves through him would seem to have goodwill to themselves rather than to him. Likewise, they would seem to be friends to themselves rather than to him if they attend to him because he is of some use to them. And altogether, goodwill results from some sort of virtue and decency whenever one person finds another to be apparently fine or brave or something else. Here, Aristotle seems to be equating goodwill with a will to do good to another for his own sake, rather than to gain benefits for oneself. On this view, friendship that's based on utility or pleasure do involve goodwill, but only towards oneself, not goodwill towards another. Thus, it would seem that only the friendship of virtue is true friendship, because only it truly involves goodwill towards another. But that presupposes that the virtue and decency of the friend is a condition of friendship. This is because only the friend's inherent goodness can elicit goodwill. So that's the apparent idea there. Chapter 6 adds another condition of friendship, concord. Friends, in other words, must agree in their decision-making. That's what he has in mind by concord, is agreement in decision-making. They must share their decisions in common. This is especially the case in situations in which political friendships form out of consensus decision-making. How is such agreement possible? Looking at our political environment, we might say it's not possible. But again, it seems to be possible only if the concord is between virtuous people. Section 3 of chapter 6, page 171. Now, this sort of concord is found in decent people, for they are in concord with themselves and with each other, since they are practically of the same mind. For their wishes are stable, not flowing back and forth like a tidal strait. They wish for what is just and advantageous, and also seek it in common. Base people, however, cannot be in concord, except to a slight degree, just as they can be friends only to a slight degree. For they seek to overreach in benefits to themselves and shirk labors and public services. And since each wishes this for himself, he interrogates and obstructs his neighbor, for when people do not look out for the common good, it is ruined. The result is that they are in conflict, trying to compel one another, but not wishing to do the just thing for themselves. So concord only results from the virtuous person's desire to do what's good in itself, good and fine and necessary things. And if you don't have that desire, then you're not going to be able to have concord in decision-making among people. So that's one respect in which it seems like virtue is the characteristic of this kind of friendship, which especially pertains to political friendship, as we also saw in Book 8, that this idea of a political friendship, what makes possible a political society of whatever size. Next, Aristotle turns to a detailed examination of self-love. Self-love. And chapter 7 is a kind of prolegomena to this, in which Aristotle develops an analogy, I would say, for self-love. So the question of self-love is, what is it to love oneself? What are the conditions of self-love? What might self-love be compared to? And is self-love something that's good, or is it something bad? Is it something we should approve of, or should we disapprove of self-love? Often people equate self-love with selfishness, egoism, or egotism. So these are all some of the questions, philosophical questions that arise about self-love. And we can see what the relevance of this is going to be. If Aristotle is going to develop this idea of friendship to oneself, and even develop the general theory of friendship as another myself, where the friend is conceived as another myself, this whole issue of loving oneself needs to be worked through. And first, in beginning this, in chapter 7, Aristotle makes a comparison of self-love and the love that a benefactor has to his or her beneficiary. He says, people have often puzzled at the fact that benefactors seem to love their beneficiaries more than the other way around, more than beneficiaries love their benefactors. And why is this a puzzle? Well, it's thought that it's the beneficiaries who are getting all the benefit, and they should have more love than the former. I think we see this, first of all, probably in parents and children, where parents typically love their children more than children love their parents. And one might think, well, the children are the ones getting all the benefit. Shouldn't they love more? And Aristotle gives some explanations for why the love of the beneficiaries towards the benefactors might be restricted. I'm going to skip over those and just look at this very interesting remark he makes in section 4, where he thinks that the reason that benefactors have this greater love, it can be explained by certain fundamental metaphysical facts. And it's really this that is going to be relevant to how he interprets self-love. So he says in section 4, page 172, the case of benefactors then resembles this. For the beneficiary is their product, and hence they like him more than the product likes the producer. Again, if you're thinking of an example, the pretty literal example would be the child-parent relation, where the child is understood as the product of the parent. But this could also obtain in the case of, let's say, a teacher-student, where you could view, the teacher could view the student's accomplishments as in part something that they produced because they were the ones who brought the student along and so on. And then in more indirect ways, any way in which someone benefits someone, you can say that you're sort of responsible for that reality, that actuality that exists in the beneficiary. And so that's your product. That's what he's got in mind. The reason for this is that being is choice-worthy and lovable for all. And we are insofar as we are actual, since we are insofar as we live and act. Now, the product is, in a way, the producer in his actuality. Hence, the producer is fond of the product because he loves his own being. This is natural, since what he is potentially is what the product indicates in actuality. We could spend a whole lecture just on this. What he's describing as the actuality of the benefactor, it seems a lot like Hegel's idea of the for itself. The actuality, it's sort of like my activity is a kind of nothing unless it results in some kind of change in the world. And that would be my actuality. So I get to contemplate my actuality and those changes that my activity has made in the world. And this is concentrated in the beneficiary of my activities. So I get to contemplate my own actuality in the thing I benefited. If I'm a hairdresser, I get to contemplate my actuality in looking at that person whose hair I just fixed up for the Oscars or whatever. That would be, the example. I look at myself and the child, and I see my actuality, the mother gazing on the child. So he concludes at the bottom of the page on 172. This is also why mothers love their children more than fathers do, or more than children love their mothers, since giving birth is more effort for them, and they know better that the children are theirs. And this also would seem to be proper to benefactors. Okay. The example of the mother raises the question of what one should love most, oneself or another. Aristotle observes that self-lovers are typically denounced as selfish individuals and regarded as base people. By contrast, it seems that the decent person acts for the sake of the other more than himself, and hence he acts for the sake of the fine, not his own self-interest. However, matters turn out not to be so simple. In fact, there are two kinds of self-love, a base kind of self-love and a noble kind of self-love. It can easily be demonstrated that there must be a noble kind of self-love. After all, the greatest love that one has is for the friend. The greatest love one has is for the friend. And the better friends are the ones that we ought to love most of all. So the greatest love, what's the greatest love you can have? It's the love for the friend. Which friends ought you to love most of all? Well, you should love the better friends most of all. Those are the ones who are most deserving of your love, after all, the better friends. So I take those to be uncontroversial points. However, as he says in section 2 of the chapter, quote, one is a friend to another most of all if he wishes goods to the other for the other's sake, even if no one knows about it, unquote. So how do you show your friendship? You are wishing goods to the other, even if no one knows about it. Well, those features that I just described apply most of all to your relationship to yourself. You're the best friend to yourself, and you're the one who you most of all wish goods to yourself. And if it's true that one is friend to oneself most of all, and one is the best friend to oneself, then it's also true that one should love oneself most of all. So why has self-love gotten such a bad reputation then? If, morally speaking, you should love yourself most of all because you're your own best friend. Well, self-love has gotten a bad reputation because of the base form of self-love, in which people who regard money, bodily pleasures, and honors as the greatest things award them to themselves most of all, and so overreach, right? They engage in this pleonexia that we talked about in an earlier video. They overreach, and so they become greedy, and people resent them, and they think that they're self-lovers, and they badmouth self-love on account of that. But intrinsically, self-love is a good thing. The true lover loves himself, though, because of the fine and virtuous actions he's done and is capable of, and will continue to do, because he will continue to do fine and good actions. That's why you love yourself. So that would be the ideal, that the lover of self loves himself because of the fine and virtuous actions he's done. And because he knows he will continue to do fine and virtuous actions. And because of that, he loves himself. This kind of self-lover is ready and willing to sacrifice money, pleasures, honors in order to benefit others over himself, since that's often a fine and virtuous thing to do. Whereas the bad kind of self-lover who overreaches and just showers all these external goods on himself is guided by his feelings. The good kind is guided by his reason. And so we should encourage the virtuous person to love himself. But by the same token, we should encourage the vicious person not to love himself. Okay, this brings us to chapter 9, and at this point, Aristotle raises a puzzle. Way back in book 1, we saw the association contained in the Greek notion of happiness, or eudaimonia, between happiness and self-sufficiency. Happiness and self-sufficiency. Recall that. The happy person, it's thought, must be a self-sufficient person, must be lacking in nothing. Everyone thinks that the happy person lacks nothing, is self-sufficient in that sense. However, friendship seems to involve a dependency on others. So does this mean that the happy person won't need friends? That's the puzzle that arises. This apparent tension between the notion that happiness involves self-sufficiency and the natural idea that happiness will involve having friends. And Aristotle has a quick and relatively superficial response to this question, which is that man is by nature a political animal. We have an instinct for sociability. We are social animals, and thus we need friends in order to be happy. So simply at a biological level, we're social animals. We don't thrive in isolation biologically, and so we need friends. And this response is a necessary one, certainly, and it's useful in that it relates friendship and happiness to the biological basis for ethics that Aristotle's been relying upon since the function argument in book 1. However, there's a much deeper point about the role of friendship within the happy life and within Aristotle's conception of eudaimonia that's going on here. And this brings us back to the point in my introduction to this video that I wanted to get to about the central role that I think that his account of friendship actually has in his overall ethical theory, namely of filling the gap between the philosophical derivation of the virtuous life as the proper fulfillment of the human function and therefore the essence of eudaimonia on the one hand, and on the other hand, the idea that, well, the virtuous life by itself isn't sufficient for eudaimonia because you also need to have this adequate supply of external goods, things like health and wealth and honor and so forth. So there's a real sense, I want to suggest, in which the theory of happiness fills a gap in his ethical theory as a whole and thus plays an essential role. The essential role that his conception of happiness played may not have been immediately apparent, but it's there, I would say, definitely there. And that is this idea that friendship is the link between virtue and external goods within the happy life. Following my usual practice, make a big point, we write it down. So we should keep in mind this is largely an interpretation, a disputable one, but I think it explains what this account of friendship is doing here at this place in the Nicomachean ethics. Aristotle wants to say that friendship is the link between virtue and external goods within the happy life. It unifies those two parts that seemed like they were two extrinsic parts of Aristotle's theory of eudaimonia at the end of Book 1. It unifies them together into a coherent system, a systematic account that can be described as Aristotle's total theory, his whole theory of what eudaimonia is. So friendship is the link between virtue and external goods within the happy life. That's the main claim I want to justify here in 10 minutes or less. So we saw Aristotle's function argument establish that happiness was the virtuous activity. However, common sense told us that virtuous activity by itself was not enough for happiness. It also required an adequate amount of external goods. And there was something philosophically dissatisfying about this account. First, it was an unphilosophical concession to common sense that remained outside of what could be established with philosophical argument. This should be viewed as an unacceptable result from a philosophical perspective. That we have our theory, our philosophical derivation of what eudaimonia should consist in, namely the virtuous life, but yet that philosophical derivation didn't get us everything that it seems like eudaimonia requires, because it didn't explain why do we also need these external goods. Why can't the need for external goods be derived from the notion of the human function? Is there another philosophical argument that can do better at getting us a more unified conception of happiness? Can the need for external goods be derived from a philosophical principle of some sort, or must it be left as just a brute opinion of common sense, a concession of common sense? These were troubling questions that the function argument left over and that we hadn't dwelt on, I don't think, sufficiently before, but they are a real problem for Aristotle's theory. The question left by a merely external compounding of virtue and external goods is, how are these things united? How are these things united? How are virtue and external goods united? And if we don't have such an account, we're going to see, as we actually saw, I would say, in subsequent Greek ethics, in the ancient world generally, Greco-Roman ethics, in the Hellenistic schools of Stoicism, Epicureanism, we had the Stoics lean strong on the idea that virtue by itself is sufficient. And then the Epicureans lean stronger on the idea that actually virtue is about procuring external goods. And so if you don't view Aristotle as having a way to bring these two together, they would tend to separate out in subsequent philosophical grapplings with the problem. So there's that philosophical issue here. But there's also a practical problem, and that's the second thing. So the first problem is this philosophical dissatisfaction with leaving external goods just dangling out there as this unaccounted for remainder that the function argument couldn't explain as part of eudaimonia. That's the first problem, which is purely philosophical, admittedly. But there's also a practical problem. When I was deciding what should I do, what should I pursue in my life, how should I pursue happiness, there's this practical problem concerning the vagueness of the notion of an adequate amount in the phrase adequate amount of external goods. An adequate amount. What's adequate? What's an adequate amount of pleasure, honor, money? And since these things, of course, are diverse goods, how much do we need of each? Can one do without one type? For example, honor, if we have an overabundance of another type, such as money. You know, is it better to pursue a life where I can make a lot of money if I'm doing so in a way that's regarded as being sort of shady and that damages my reputation? Like being a stockbroker or something like that, or a plaintiff attorney? Is that the way to go? Or should I satisfy myself with a lesser amount of money if I can do so in a way that preserves my good name intact? How do I answer those questions? How much pleasure should I pursue for the sake, let's say, of my health? Should I refrain from pleasures in order to be more careful about my health, but therefore I deprive myself of pleasures by, let's say, absolutely abstaining from rich foods for the sake of preserving my health, but then I deprive myself of the enjoyment of having some of those foods. So how do I balance these things? So these are practical problems that result if we leave this question of how virtue relates to external goods as just a kind of extrinsic question. Now, I don't want to give the false expectation that Aristotle is going to completely answer all these difficulties, either the philosophical or the practical difficulties that were left over from Book 1. But I do want to suggest that friendship does provide a principled link between the life of virtue and external goods, and for two reasons that are involved here. One is that the life of virtue needs friends in order to be exercised. The life of virtue needs friends in order to be exercised. And I would say that there's sort of two ways. I don't have the space here on the board to put these up, but there are two ways in which the life of virtue needs friends in order to be exercised. One is that friends assist us in performing virtuous actions and in developing virtues. Friends assist us in performing virtuous actions and in developing virtues. Think about like the way in which having comrades at arms assisting you provides encouragement to the brave person. That would be just one example, many examples that you could apply to all of the virtues. So friends assist us in performing virtuous actions and developing virtues, and then also friends provide us with the main recipients of our virtues, which Aristotle emphasizes. We need friends in order to have people to, as it were, bestow our virtues on. So in both those ways, friends assist us in performing virtuous actions in the first place and developing virtues like encouraging us and so forth. And also friends provide us with the main recipients of our virtues. These are ways in which the life of virtue needs friends in order to be exercised. But also, life with friends is itself the greatest of external goods. Aristotle explicitly says it is the greatest of external goods. And we can also see, at least implicitly, that it's connected with the other ones. I'll just summarize this by saying it helps us obtain the others. So life with friends is itself the greatest of all external goods, and it helps us to obtain the others as the means for obtaining and enjoying the other external goods. Can you name something more useful than having a lot of good friends when it comes to obtaining other external goods, like pleasure, money, honor, and so on? That would be the challenge to someone who would disagree with Aristotle on what I think is his point here. So this is how friendship provides the link between virtue and external goods. One of the primary ways in which friends provide an external good may be a bit unexpected. Virtuous friends provide a unique sort of pleasure to the virtuous person. They provide the pleasure of being able to observe one's own virtuous actions in another. He says, if you look on, this is section 5 on page 176, we said at the beginning that happiness is a kind of activity, and clearly activity comes into being and does not belong to someone all the time as a possession does. Now, if being happy consists in living and being active, the activity of the good person is excellent and hence pleasant in itself, as we said at the beginning. What is our own is also pleasant, and we are able to observe our neighbors more than ourselves, and to observe their actions more than our own. It follows that a good person finds pleasure in the actions of excellent people who are his friends. since these actions are both the naturally pleasant features, since they are good and they are his own. The blessed person, therefore, will need virtuous friends, given that he decides to observe virtuous actions that are his own, and the actions of a virtuous person who is his friend are of this sort. What does he have in mind? In part, the idea seems to be that the virtuous actions of our virtuous friends are like the benefactor's product, the beneficiary that we discussed previously. He can see the fruits of his labor, of our cultivation of virtue, our encouragement, and our assistance in the friend that we have benefited through our virtuous activity. But also, Aristotle probably has in mind here the idea that he'll mention explicitly in section 10, which is that the friend is another myself. And as another myself, it reflects the friend that is, reflects our common decisions and typical activities. And so it allows me to observe myself in action in a way that's difficult or impossible to do when I'm actually engaged in the heat of battle, so to speak, in the heat of an action. I can't observe myself. So, for example, a Spartan can admire the bravery of his fellow Spartans and thereby admire his own bravery, the type of bravery that he himself has. I think I recently saw the film Midway, where there's a scene with a pilot who's been shot down and sitting there in the ocean amidst the Japanese fleet that's under attack by these American dive bombers, and he's cheering on the bombers striking a Japanese carrier. That's a good image, a modern image of him observing another myself, people doing the same kind of activities, exhibiting the same kind of virtues of bravery, certainly, that he exhibited. And he's able to enjoy, observe that and enjoy it in a way that he couldn't when he was in the heat of battle himself. Now, the essence of life for a rational animal is perception and thought. Action is a part of living, but in the case of human beings, life is defined, Aristotle says, by our capacity for perception, perceiving, and understanding. That's section 7, page 177. Now, the most choice-worthy life is the life of the decent and blessed person. However, this assumes that the choice-worthiness does not only exist, but that it's also perceived. In a real sense, the very goodness and pleasantness of life consists of our perception of this goodness and pleasantness. If our life couldn't be good and pleasant if we didn't perceive it. And in a real sense, it consists of not only the action, but in the perception of this action. Thus, insofar as the friend is another myself, my perception of the friend is also a perception of the goodness and choice-worthiness of her life as well. So he makes this argument, section 10, 177 through 178, the end of the chapter. The excellent person is related to his friend in the same way as he is related to himself, since a friend is another himself. Therefore, just as his own being is choice-worthy for him, his friend's being is choice-worthy for him in the same or a similar way. We saw that someone's own being is choice-worthy because he perceives that he is good, and this sort of perception is pleasant in itself. He ought then to perceive his friend's being together with his own, and he will do this when they live together. That is to say, they share conversation and thought. For in the case of the human being, what seems to count as living together is this sharing of conversation and thought, not sharing the same pasture as in the case of grazing animals. If then, for the blessedly happy person, being is choice-worthy, since it is naturally good and pleasant, and if the being of his friend is closely similar to his own, his friend will also be choice-worthy. What is choice-worthy for him he ought to possess, since otherwise he will in this respect lack something. Anyone who is to be happy then will need excellent friends. Aristotle's argument here is admittedly not easy to understand. Perhaps he's saying something like this. And I see I'm running short on time here, so I'm just going to go through this argument once. I'll go through it slowly. You can rewind and go over it again if you need to. So here's my reconstruction of the argument from the passage I just read, something like this. Premise 1. Happiness for a person consists in her life being choice-worthy, as well as that person possessing her choice-worthy life. Premise 2. The virtuous person's life is choice-worthy. Premise 3. To possess one's own choice-worthy life, one must perceive that it is choice-worthy. Premise 4. The virtuous person's friend, however, is another self to that person. Premise 5. Thus, the virtuous person's friend's life will be similar to her own. Premise 6. Thus, this friend's life will also be choice-worthy. Premise 7. Hence, to possess all that is his or her own and choice-worthy, the virtuous person must also perceive that the friend's life is choice-worthy. Premise 8. To perceive this, the friends must live together and share conversation and thought. Conclusion. Therefore, to be happy, the virtuous person must live together with her virtuous friends and share conversation and thought with them. So that's the argument. Now, this closing argument of chapter 9 naturally raises the question. It seems that since one is more than two, it's better to have as one's own two choice-worthy lives rather than merely one. And if that's the case, wouldn't it be still better to have three? And better once more to have four, and so on? It seems that Aristotle has to say yes, and that in general, the person with more friends is happier and more blessed than the person with fewer. But then the question naturally arises, where does it end? How many friends are enough? Can one ever have too many friends, or is it always better to have more friends? Aristotle's answer, I think, is very reasonable. He says there's no exact number that is the right number of friends, but there are certain lower and upper limits. At the lower limit, it's already been established that one can't be happy without having some friends. So presumably one must at least have some friends. But what about the upper limit? And this is set by Aristotle's condition that the friends must live together. This is on 178, 179. He says, now clearly one cannot live with many people and distribute oneself among them. Further, these many people must also be friends to one another if they are all to spend their days together, and this is hard work for many people to manage. It also proves to be difficult for many to share one another's enjoyments and distresses as their own, since one is quite likely to find oneself sharing one friend's pleasure and another's grief at the same time. Presumably, then, it is good not to seek as many friends as possible, and it is good to have no more than enough for living together. Indeed, it even seems impossible to be an extremely close friend to many people. That is why it also seems impossible to be passionately in love with many people, since passionate erotic love tends to be an excess of friendship, and one has this for one person. Hence, one also has extremely close friendships with a few people. All right, this completes Aristotle's account of friendship. The final two brief chapters round out the account with remarks about friendship that will be familiar to us and that can be passed over without special comment. He notes that friends are needed both in good times and in bad, and that friends share their favorite activities with one another, which no doubt we all agree is the case. So we can wrap this up with the second discussion question. Second discussion question. Is having friends essential, as Aristotle seems to believe, to both the virtuous life and the life with an adequate amount of external goods? Can one lead a life of virtuous activity without friends? Can one obtain an adequate supply of external goods without friends? Does having virtuous friends ensure that one will also have an adequate supply of external goods? How many friends does one need for virtuous living and sufficient external goods? Justify your answer. So here, we'll put this up one last time. I'm asking you basically about this view, this interpretation that I'm giving. Second discussion question, is having friends essential, as Aristotle seems to believe, both to the virtuous life and the life with an adequate amount of external goods? Can one lead a life of virtuous activity without friends? Can one obtain an adequate supply of external goods without friends? Does having virtuous friends ensure that one will also have an adequate supply of external goods? How many friends does one need for virtuous living and sufficient external goods? Justify your answers.